I was saying that most people won't tell you the costs of living off grid. Maybe they don't know them, or maybe they don't want to share them. I don't think that many people will be honest, or as honest as I am, with you guys about what it costs to live off grid. I think some people might have a naive idea of like living off grid will be free. And you can work towards that goal of reducing all your costs, but like planting a banana tree or a papaya tree properly, there's going to be some upfront work that needs to be done or upfront costs. So I think when you talk about living off grid, the first thing that you need to ask yourself while you're counting the costs or preparing is, where are you going to live off grid? And understand that not all places are considered, or not all places that you could live off grid are equal. That they wouldn't be all the same. As an example, living off grid in the North Pole will look a lot different than living off grid in Mexico. So when you think about living off grid, you have to think about the climate, the geography of where you're living, and then the cost up front will be where you're living on the land. Are you going to own that land, or are you going to try to rent that land or squat on the land? Or what some people do is go to the middle of nowhere in a forest and just hide off grid. So depending on those scenarios, some people set up off grid cabins in their parents' backyard, for example. I've seen that. So the first cost will be, assessing where you're going to do this off grid project, and if you're going to purchase the land or not. And that could be, or rent the land. That could be either a recurring cost if you're renting, or it can be an upfront cost of buying the land. When you look into buying the land, specifically to the point of wanting to live there off grid, there are some things that you should consider. If you're choosing the whole world as um, your option, if the whole world is open to you, then if you're going to be harnessing electricity from the elements, I would say to you, again, it's not all equal. Consider where has the most sunshine in the world if you're going to be using solar electric. Think about where has the most wind in the world if you plan on getting some wind power. And you can't go wrong with buying property or having property with a river either in it, through it, or near it. You'll always need fresh water, and hydroelectric power can be harnessed from an AC alternator to charge your batteries or give you direct power during the day, or as long as the river's flowing. So that's something to consider. So if you're buying this like pristine property with all those things, with wind, with sun access year round, and with flowing water, then the price tag for your property will go up, obviously, and it depends on where in the world you buy it. So this is going to be your first research project, and your first major cost will be where in the world your off-grid project will be. So I can't tell you the cost there, and you can work with almost any backdrop or any scenario being off-grid. People do, right? But they're not all equal, and that's something that you should think about before jumping into trying to live off-grid. I would say, where in the world just from one guy to another, where in the world can people live without risk of freezing to death? I would narrow your search down to those type of places. It will make it easier for you to live off grid and grow food in those type of places where people won't freeze to death. There are places in the world where people literally freeze to death, animals freeze to death, and you could look at that as a positive depending on your doomsday scenario. In a doomsday scenario where people are freezing to death, you might want to be in the cold because there's less risk of people coming to take all your stuff. Whereas if you're living in an environment where people don't freeze to death in the winter and things don't freeze, then people can find you and it's more accessible to the masses. So this is again something to think about, or why you're preparing to live off grid. These are some things to consider as far as the costs go that I can't really tell you. All the real estate costs and upfront costs, you'll have to do some research, but this is kind of like a beginning of the subject, beginning of the topic of how much is it going to cost to live off grid. In our case, we have this farmland, and there are nuances to the property and what we can and can't have on the property according to Portuguese law. And that's something that you need to know. What can you have on the property? Can you build permanent structures? Do you have to have everything on wheels, like crown property in Canada? Are you allowed to build on it? Is it, what are the taxes? This type of thing. You should look into that. But our upfront cost for the property was, you know, affordable. We bought the land all out, and our yearly taxes on it will be something like 300 euros. But let's just say for less than 100,000 euros, I bought this property and we own it clear. So your boy owns property in Europe. You could do the same thing. I could guide you. Follow along for the other parts, and we'll continue the chat about the costs of living off grid.